may be more appropriate. I will say that I have been able to follow more detransitioners lately, but most social media sites attempt to silence them while catering to the trans radicals and groomers attempting to sway your children into transitioning. Even as more and more evidence emerges, WPATH remains unyielding. Their actions, and now their own words, have clearly revealed their true agenda, which is influencing policy and winning lawsuits, even if it means concealing inconvenient evidence. For far too long, WPATH has misled many into believing it is a scientific authority. Now that their emails and videos of their meetings have been revealed, and more likely there will be more unsealed soon, one can only wonder how long they can maintain this charade. It is my personal opinion that WPATH is destroying our children and use their time shaking hands and collecting their share of the money from the pharmaceutical companies and doctors for their assistance in destroying and sterilizing an entire generation of our nation. Parents of gender-distressed children have placed their trust in the medical establishment, turning to WPATH for expert guidance. Unfortunately, WPATH has consistently shown a lack of concern for the well-being of the children it claims to support. These families deserve so much better. WPATH should be identified for what it truly is, a fringe activist organization, and its standards of care for trans medicine, which American medical groups vow to adhere to, and they don't, and their claims of being evidence-based, which they aren't, and should be categorically excluded from clinical decision-making. Many of WPATH's documents were subpoenaed by the state of Alabama as part of a lawsuit, Bough versus Marshall, wherein Alabama parents, medical providers, and a Birmingham pastor named Paul Eknes Tucker sued the state because of its ban on gender-affirming care for minors and the criminalization of those who practice it. I am appalled that so many parents, medical providers, and especially a pastor cannot accept that gender-affirming care for minors is not safe and effective. Minors do not have the mental capacity to make such decisions and make permanent patients for the pharmaceutical companies and, in my opinion, corrupt doctors. If you are truly following this nightmare in our nation, then you probably got a sneak peek of some WPATH internal communications a few weeks ago when the advocacy group Do No Harm shared emails between Johns Hopkins and the Federal Health and Human Services Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality. The Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality had been asked to conduct a systematic evidence review on gender-affirming care and knew that WPATH had hired Johns Hopkins University researchers to conduct such a review. The emails show that Johns Hopkins did conduct a systematic review and that, like all other systematic reviews, it found diddly squat in terms of evidence supporting the efficacy of hormones and surgery. But WPATH prevented Johns Hopkins from publishing these reviews because they didn't come to WPATH's preferred conclusions. WPATH hid this very important information from the entire world, then published standards of care saying an evidence review was impossible, and a government agency knew this. We're talking about kids and the most invasive possible interventions here. We are talking about venerable academic institutions and government agencies and censorship and secrets. Turns out there's a whole hell of a lot more of these damning emails. The New York Times had access to a lot of them, but chose not to cover them. It's my understanding that this is because no one at Johns Hopkins would comment on the record. An executive summary of the documents say, WPATH leadership went to great lengths to suppress systematic reviews commissioned by Johns Hopkins because the review's conclusions did not support the WPATH plans to recommend wide access to hormones and surgeries for all those who desired them. The evidence suppression was achieved via a two-pronged strategy. First, WPATH forced Johns Hopkins University to withdraw the manuscript they had already submitted for publication, as they did not meet the desired conclusions. Next, WPATH instituted a new policy where WPATH would have to approve all future publications by Johns Hopkins University. So let's talk a little bit more about the WPATH policy. WPATH developed an approval checklist which required that the authors must have the, quote, intention to use the data for the benefit of advancing transgender health in a positive manner, unquote. The content approval must involve WPATH Standards of Care 8 chapter leads, and the review must include, quote, at least one member of the transgender community in the design, drafting of the article, and the final approval of the article, unquote. 2 levels of WPATH approval were required before Johns Hopkins could submit for publication. First, the proposal, which includes the conclusion, had to be approved, and then the actual manuscript draft, with WPATH retaining the rights to alter content. I ask, why is WPATH so dead set on destroying our children? Only the reviews passing both levels of approval could be submitted by Johns Hopkins for publication, and they had to carry a specific disclaimer that, quote, the authors are solely responsible for the content of the manuscript, and the manuscript does not necessarily reflect the view of WPATH in the publication. Okay, they just said that they have to see the actual manuscript and they have to approve it before it's sent in. That is not, taking WPATH's view out of the equation. Can you believe Johns Hopkins agreed to this? This is not science. WPATH is not credible, and this is why we in America are still sterilizing and mutilating children in the name of gender-affirming care. We're not basing guidelines on systematic reviews or reality. We're basing them on an activist group's political agenda, and even the Department of Health and Human Services knows there's no good evidence. In fact, the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality was asked to review guidelines for treating gender dysphoric youth back in 2020 because the request said, quote, there is a lack of current evidence-based guidance for care of children and adolescents who identify as transgender, particularly regarding the benefits and harms of pubertal suppression, medical affirmation with hormone therapy, and surgical affirmation. While these are some existing guidelines and standards of care, most are derived from expert opinions and have not been updated recently, so a comprehensive evidence review is currently not available. What did the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality decide after communicating with the Johns Hopkins research? The Evidence-Based Practice Centers program will not develop a new systematic review because we found protocols for 2 systematic reviews that addresses portions of the nomination, and an insufficient number of primary studies exist to address the remainder of the nomination. Basically, they said someone was already doing it and there wasn't enough evidence to sort through. But the someone already doing it had already agreed to put science aside and only discuss the benefits and not the harms. Why is a federal agency abdicating its responsibility? But wouldn't you know it, the Assistant Secretary for the Health and Human Services is Dr. Rachel Levine. And as a New York Times reported, Levine pressured WPATH to remove age restrictions from guidelines, not based on science again, but on advocating for Levine's own trans community. It's officially a scandal now, and all goes all the way to the White House. Newly court documents reveal that the leading global authority on medical transitions for minors prioritized political goals over children's well-being in developing their guidelines. The World Professional Association for Transgender Health, WPATH, is a nonprofit organization of self-identified experts in transgender healthcare known for its influential standards of care guidelines. These guidelines are endorsed by numerous medical organizations and widely adopted by pediatric gender clinics in the United States and internationally. WPATH claims these guidelines are evidence-based and represent the gold standard for treating gender dysphoria. Their recommendations advocate a highly medicalized approach for youth, including puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and gender-related surgeries. This past week, a treasure trove of subpoenaed internal communications from WPATH unsealed in a federal lawsuit regarding Alabama's age restrictions on gender-affirming care for minors reveal that their guidance is driven more by activism than by scientific evidence. The Alabama Attorney General submitted a motion for summary judgment to the U.S. Circuit Court summarizing extensive evidence gathered through subpoenas and depositions. Among the revelations was a damning statement from the authors of WPATH's most recent Standards of Care 8 edition. Our concern, echoed by the social justice lawyers we spoke with, is that evidence-based review reveals little or no evidence and puts us in an untenable position in terms of affecting policy or winning lawsuits. Having reported on the inadequacies of the evidence supporting the gender-affirming model of care for minors for over 2 years, I never expected to see such a blatant admission. The statement demonstrates that WPATH's priorities lie not in the best interest of vulnerable children, but in achieving its political objectives. When evidence does not fit their narrative that gender-affirming care is medically necessary, life-saving health care backed by robust evidence, they are willing to conceal it. Let's delve a little more into this situation and the lawsuit. In an executive summary posted on the LGBT Courage website, in 2022, the state of Alabama passed a law that restricts medical transition services for those under 18. The state was promptly sued by the ACLU. As a result of the lawsuit, several documents had to be produced by WPATH to the court regarding their Standards of Care 8 procedures. Last month, the United States District Court, Middle District of Alabama, Northern Division, put on the docket several documents regarding how WPATH Standards of Care was developed, specifically the email exchanges and documents related to the relationship between WPATH and Johns Hopkins University, which was commissioned to review the evidence. Many more documents will be unsealed shortly. The already unsealed documents paint a troubling picture. WPATH leadership went to great lengths to suppress systematic reviews commissioned from Johns Hopkins because the review's conclusions did not support WPATH plans to recommend wide access to hormones and surgeries for all those who desired them. The evidence suppression was achieved via a two-pronged strategy. First, WPATH urged Johns Hopkins University to withdraw the manuscripts they had already submitted for publication, as they did not meet the desired conclusions. Next, WPATH instituted a policy whereby WPATH would have to approve all future publications by Johns Hopkins University. The new approval process required that all reviews meet a special WPATH checklist, which included items such as whether the review positively contributes to promoting transgender interventions, if it includes transgender people as authors, etc. WPATH required 2 rounds of approval. first at the proposal stage, which had to prove the review's anticipated conclusions, and second at the final manuscript stage. WPATH reserved the right to alter the content. The new policy also required that final publication carry the disclaimer that WPATH had no influence over the process and that the views are solely by the Johns Hopkins University authors. This post factum approval policy led to a heated debate between WPATH and Johns Hopkins University, with Johns Hopkins University protesting undue WPATH interference and asserting its academic freedom and contractual ability to publish. But in the end, WPATH prevailed. The offending reviews that had led to the development of the approval policy, were never published. Okay, so WPATH reserves the right to alter the content. So if they don't like what Johns Hopkins reviewers had to say, well, then they could just negate that and say you can't print this. It doesn't go in line with our policies. Notably, only one review was ever published after the policy was put in place. Baker et al. Review of Hormonal Interventions. The Baker systematic review is problematic. It did not evaluate any physical harms, despite the protocol stating so, and its pro-medicalization conclusions contradicted the review's actual findings. The systematic review carries the disclaimer stating that WPATH had no role in the review, ironically using the exact language required by the approval policy. Internal documents confirm that Baker et al. Went through the approval process. The unsealed documents not only demonstrate that WPATH manipulated the evidence, but also show other problems. For example, unmanaged conflicts of interest, activism-driven agendas, etc. More documents are expected to be unsealed soon, likely containing even more damaging information about WPATH's credibility as an organization. Some key points in all of this are that on April the 1st, 2018, WPATH entered into a contract with Johns Hopkins to conduct systematic reviews of evidence for the upcoming Standards of Care 8. The contract negotiations throughout 2017 and 2018 were contentious, as WPATH tried to insert clauses that would give permission to control the systematic review publications, while Johns Hopkins University wanted to retain academic freedom and scientific integrity of the process. The negotiations were reaching an impasse, and Johns Hopkins University nearly walked away, but the contract was eventually signed in favor of the Johns Hopkins University position. WPATH, I just call them WPATH because they irritate me to no end, but anyway. WPATH was demanding control over publications, saying, quote, "If we are paying for the data review through a fee for services, why wouldn't we own the results?" Karen Robinson, associated with Johns Hopkins, refused to allow WPATH control over the content of the publications, stating, first, Johns Hopkins is an academic institution, and I, as a faculty member therein, will not sign something that limits academic freedom in this manner. In other words, a sponsor cannot change or suppress publication of research. Second, I will not sign off on language that goes against current standards of systematic reviews and guidelines development. It is my understanding that WPATH wanted to move toward a current standards for guideline development. To do so, the review team needs to be independent. I hope we can come to an agreement, unquote. Eventually, however, the contract was signed without the control WPATH desired. In addition to conducting evidence synthesis, Johns Hopkins University also served as a consultant to the WPATH guideline development process overall. developing special conflict of interest forums, educating WPATH on how to structure the research questions, etc. As Johns Hopkins University engaged with WPATH, they became concerned about unmanaged WPATH conflicts of interest in the process that was already well underway. Johns Hopkins University noted that in their email communications that, quote, we would expect many, if not most, SOC 8 members to have competing interest. Disclosure and any necessary management of potential conflicts should take place prior to the selection of guideline members. Unfortunately, this was not done here, but the decision was made to adhere as much as possible to the practice for guideline development. WPATH guideline authors objected to the process of conflict of interest disclosures, noting, quote, unlike other medical guidelines, trans healthcare is a socially and politically charged issue and often subject to laws and policy outside the author's control. These also can change any time in the future, prior or after SOC 8 are published. The question about the author now or in the future subject to being in conflict to the SOC 8 recommendations is impossible for many of us to answer no to. In the end, it does appear that there was meaningful management of conflict of interest. Excuse me. In the end, it does not appear that there was any meaningful management of conflict of interest. The WPATH team likewise developed major reservations about the Johns Hopkins team and the evidence-based process Johns Hopkins University was devising. At one point, a senior WPATH leader stated, quote, might I jump in and ask about the research review team? Johns Hopkins? Would it make sense for us to meet with them at least once to provide some context? Do they deeply understand gender care and the broader gender spectrum? Unquote. Another senior WPATH leader wrote ahead of a planning meeting that he, quote, would not like that this recommendation was graded as insufficient or inadequate, unquote. The communications show that the WPATH team does not appear to understand evidence-based medicine. The Johns Hopkins team must explain key aspects such as PICOs. PICO stands for Population, Intervention, Comparison, and Outcomes, systematic reviews, and other evidence-based medicine terms and concepts multiple times. Finally, one of the senior WPATH leaders concedes that what they thought was evidence is actually at best indirect evidence and would not generate the strength of the recommendations they hope for. Quote, what our community has felt and continues to feel is evidence-based questions on stigma in community, family acceptance or rejection tied with outcomes, questions on the role of the mental health professional assessment prior to medical interventions, gender identity change efforts, conversion therapies, etc., is thought of as indirect evidence. Eventually, at least 15 questions were identified as needing a systematic review, and at least 6 chapters had completed reviews. According to the documents, there were at least 15 PICOs, and Exhibit 166 of the lawsuit contains emails between Karen Robinson of Johns Hopkins University and WPATH and reactions from WPATH chapter authors. Exhibit 168 contains questions that were planned to be evaluated in the systematic review, including, quote, what are the benefits and harms of social transition, puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, mastectomy, breast augmentation, genital surgeries, and others. At one point, likely around 2020, the following 6 standards of care chapters had been systematically reviewed and had been completed. They were assessment, primary care, endocrinology, surgery, reproductive medicine, and voice therapy. The collaborative spirit between WPATH and Johns Hopkins University seems to have evaporated abruptly when on July 27, 2020, WPATH learned of two systematic reviews that Johns Hopkins University submitted for publication and which WPATH found problematic as they did not support the WPATH desired conclusions. WPATH demanded that Johns Hopkins University withdraw the two manuscripts from publication and insisted that Johns Hopkins University follow a new approval policy for any future publications. On August the 20th, WPATH notified Johns Hopkins University that the reviews submitted by Johns Hopkins University raised, quote, many concerns noted regarding these papers by our board of directors and SOC version 8 chairs and co-chairs. While one of the three reviews had already been published, WPATH instructed Johns Hopkins University not to publish the remaining two reviews, saying we do not know the we do not know the topics of those two reviews. Further, WPATH notified Johns Hopkins University of a new approval policy that Johns Hopkins University had to publish going forward. A similar letter was sent by WPATH to the Standards of Care 8 chapter authors 3 months later in October 2020. The letter, which started out, Dear SOC 8 Working Group Members, unquote, and stated that WPATH was, quote, caught on the wrong foot, unquote, by Johns Hopkins University wanting to publish 3 systematic reviews. WPATH explains that subsequently WPATH developed a new approval policy, quote, to ensure that publication does not negatively affect the provision of transgender health care in the broadest sense, unquote. Note, completed systematic reviews does not mean the same thing as completed manuscripts ready for publication. It could mean just the evidence tables of grade evidence, So, the new approval process developed by WPATH in response to the problematic review conclusions by Johns Hopkins University requires 2 levels of WPATH approval and WPATH's ability to alter the content, while also insisting that any final publication carry a disclaimer that the manuscript content does not reflect WPATH's views and, quote, the authors are solely responsible for the content of the manuscript. Why do they want everybody to lie? That's my question. Don't they lie enough on their own? So, anyway, WPATH developed an approval checklist which required that the authors must have the, quote, intention to use the data for the benefit of advancing transgender health in a positive manner, unquote. The content approval must involve SOC 8 chapter leads, and the review must include, quote, at least one member of the transgender community in the design, drafting of the article, and the final approval of the article. 2 levels of WPATH approval were required before Johns Hopkins University could submit a publication. First, the proposal, which includes the conclusions, had to be approved, and then the actual manuscript draft, with WPATH retaining the rights to alter that content. Only the reviews passing both levels of approval could be submitted by Johns Hopkins University for publication, and they had to carry a specific disclaimer that the authors are solely responsible for the content of the manuscript, and the manuscript does not necessarily reflect the view of WPATH in the publication. Again, they're making people lie. At first, Johns Hopkins University vehemently objected to this, but later succumbed to WPATH pressures, withdrawing the 2 reviews and subjecting the only review that was published later to the invasive WPATH vetting. At first, Johns Hopkins University protested WPATH's assertion that Johns Hopkins University cannot publish the reviews and must subject to the approval policy. Karen Robinson from Johns Hopkins University stated, quote, "We have the right to publish any Johns Hopkins University publications arising out of the work conducted as part of this contract and are not subject to approval by WPATH nor subject to any policy in WPATH." Karen Robinson also reminded WPATH of the earlier disagreement before the contract was signed, where it stated clearly that Johns Hopkins University would never enter into an agreement that restrained their academic freedom and unduly influenced the process. She also stated that Johns Hopkins University is not obligated to follow a policy unilaterally instituted by WPATH post factum. Quoting from that 2018 email, Karen Robinson said, First, Hopkins is an academic institution, and I, as a faculty member therein, will not sign something that limits academic freedom in this manner. In other words, a sponsor cannot change or suppress publication of research. And 2, secondly, I will not sign off on language that goes against current standards of systematic reviews in guideline development. However, in the end, WPATH appears to have prevailed. The 2 offending reviews were withdrawn from publication. Only one review, Baker et al. In 2021, was published, and it carries all the markings of a systematic review that went through the required approvals. There was only one review that was published after the new WPATH policy was put into place. It was a systematic review of hormonal interventions. The review passed the WPATH approval policy with flying colors. The conclusions were positive, and the author was transgender, and the WPATH chapter leads were involved in shaping the systematic review. The Baker et al. Review's highly positive conclusion of the benefit of hormonal interventions are markedly disconnected from the review's actual findings, which came out as low to very low certainty to insufficient evidence. The Baker systematic review only looked at the domains where benefits are expected, for example, psychological domains, and never evaluated health domains where harms were expected, meaning physical health. The Baker systematic review carries the WPATH required disclaimer that the Johns Hopkins University authors have full responsibility for the content and that the views do not necessarily reflect WPATH. Ironically, this is still using the exact same language that was required by WPATH in their new approval policy, verbatim. Of note, there are more signs of unprofessionalism and evidence suppression associated with Baker that is beyond the documents in the Alabama discovery, but available upon request. There are further communications between community researchers and the primary author, which show Baker is highly ideologically oriented, personally conflicted, transgender man researcher stating that he is an activist first and a researcher second, and that policy goals trump research, and unprofessional even when responding to questions about his research. There is also correspondence with the editor-in-chief of the journal, which published the Baker Systematic Review, where the editor refuses multiple letters to the editor that point out problems in the Baker Review, going so far as stating that the journal is contractually obligated by the sponsor not to correct any errors in the review and that any corrections have to come from the authors themselves. A further note, other attempts to learn about the fate of the shelved reviews were met with silence. When Health and Human Services Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality department was tasked with conducting systematic reviews in the United States, contracted the Johns Hopkins University team about the status of the reviews in the registered protocols. The lead researcher, Ms. Robinson, stated that the sponsor, i.e. WPATH, would not allow them to publish. This came out through another lawsuit, Discovery. Anecdotally, at least one major medical organization evaluating its guidance was told that they will not be allowed to see the results. When other researchers, journalists, or administrators contacted WPATH or Johns Hopkins University about the state of the referenced evidence in WPATH, the response was silence. Another issue with the WPATH abandonment of the systematic review process for the adolescent chapter. The initial plan was to do systematic reviews of the benefits of hormonal treatments and of adolescent decisional capacity to consent. But the intention for the latter was promptly abandoned when it became clear that the data would not support the desired conclusion. There was a stated expectation by WPATH's adolescent chapter leads that these were two areas where a systematic review would support the medicalization of minors through evidence-based recommendations, including hormone use and capacity to consent. The email by chapter lead Scott Leibowitz stated, quote, "As you all know, the adolescent chapter is going to be one of the most scrutinized chapters in the entire standards of care. We are a unique chapter when it comes to the evidence-based review because we do feel that there is a justification to do a literature review on what we postulate will be evidence-based statements about the interventions, even though we expect the evidence to be graded low. Essentially, the literature reviews on some of our statements, as we plan on submitting once I edit them to incorporate the feedback from our work group, are important for the following reasons. Studies that demonstrate the psychological effectiveness of some of the interventions, such as blockers and hormones, in adolescent all include cohorts who went through a rather rigorous psychological assessment. We would like to talk this through as a group because it's a very important point. There is also literature on adolescent decision-making and the capacity to make informed decisions that carry lifelong ramifications. Since our chapter is a new chapter for the standards of care and it focuses in on a developmental age group and assessment, as opposed to other chapters, we are going to want to justify certain statements with graded evidence in terms of looking at the literature on decision-making in the developmental cohort, adolescents in general. Adolescent medical decision-making literature is something that the Johns Hopkins team is able to help out with in terms of a literature review and grading. Another chapter lead, DeVries, provided Karen Robinson of Johns Hopkins with, quote, some articles on decision-making in teens. These are review articles that show that there is some evidence. I think we need this sort of evidence base in decision-making capacity in adolescents regarding medical affirming treatment. Hope this is of help and clarifies what we mean. Okay, so they're telling Johns Hopkins what they want, and they don't care about what the evidence provides. After the review of documents and literature on adolescent consent, Karen Robinson of Johns Hopkins University noted by WPATH that a systematic review of the hormones is already being taken care of in the endocrine chapter, while the review of the consent literature does not suggest the evidence is promising. The plan to conduct an adolescent decisional capacity systematic review was subsequently abandoned. Likewise, other planned systematic reviews of family acceptance and social acceptance was also subsequently abandoned. At one point, Scott Leibowitz summarizes WPATH's decision in regard to evidence evaluation as, quote, very little is happening in terms of systematic reviews for our chapter, unquote. While the decision not to do systematic reviews, as they would only generate undesirable, quote, low certainty, quote, unquote, ratings, was WPATH's personal communications, which indicate personal communications with SOC8 authors, which indicate and suggest that the adolescent section authors were told by WPATH leadership that it was Johns Hopkins University who asserted that systematic reviews relating to adolescents were not possible and that the team would have to use consensus and not expect any reviews. The final language in the final WPATH SOC8 adolescent section confirms this, as the author stated, despite the slowly growing body of evidence supporting the effectiveness of early medical intervention, the number of studies is still low, and there are few outcome studies that follow youth into adulthood. Therefore, a systematic review regarding outcomes of treatments in adolescents is not possible. Notably, the SOC8 asserted that adolescents can consent and the hormonal and surgical interventions are beneficial and should be provided with no minimum age requirements, all based on consensus. Notably, the SOC8 asserted that adolescents can consent and the hormonal and surgical interventions are beneficial and should be provided with no minimum age requirements, all based on consensus, not on science. In summary, it appears that WPATH strong-armed Johns Hopkins University into not publishing the evidence, and that Johns Hopkins University at first resisted but later succumbed to the pressure. I'm assuming that pressure came from our federal government and Rachel Levine's department. Can't swear to that, but that's my assumption at this point. To date, no evidence for adolescents has been published, either for interventions themselves, such as puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and surgery, or the decision capacity. However, WPATH continues to insist its recommendations are evidence-based, as it continues to stonewall all requests to see the suppressed reviews. The same leadership engaged in WPATH's SOC8 is also now leading the World Health Organization's transgender guidelines, promising the world another evidence-based guideline. I don't trust the World Health Organization in the first place, and I'm certainly not going to trust anything they come out with regarding transgender health and transing of our children. I see nothing that is evidence-based coming out of WPATH, and I will continue on this topic in various lawsuits going on next week, since I have once again run out of time. I again thank you for joining me today on Trials and Triumphs, and suggest that you download Live 365 and make MTM Broadcasting your favorite. You can also find us MTM Broadcasting on Facebook, and let's see, they'll be on Twitter and a bunch of other places. We'll be on Rumble here in a couple of weeks. You don't want to miss anything with regard to Trials and Triumphs or the other shows produced by MTM Broadcasting. I will also say, if you would like to donate to Trials and Triumphs to help offset the costs of my research, you may do so via Cash App or Venmo to Ladena Bough, LaDenaBough. I'll talk to you all again soon, and I hope you come back and visit me again next week. Thank you so much for being here today.
To contact Trials and Triumphs, you can email Pastor Ladena Bough at trialsandtriumphs2@gmail.com. For more information, find Trials and Triumphs on Facebook and her podcast on Buzzsprout, as well as X under and Trials 56454 or Instagram under Pastor Ladena Bough.